They laughed. That is the first thing worth saying, because it is the thing she would remember longest, longer than the cold and longer than the hunger. Let us begin. At 47, with a widow's black gone gray at the cuffs and a single carpet bag holding everything she still owned in this world, Cora Ellison stood in the auction yard of Cinnabar Springs, Colorado, in the raw autumn of 1893, and spent nearly the last of her money on a thing no one else in the territory wanted. The man who had put her out was Ezra Crandall, president of the Miners and Merchants Bank, who had foreclosed on her late husband's cottage the week the silver price collapsed and told her, with his soft banker's smile, that sentiment was not legal tender. She had $11.40 folded in a handkerchief. She spent 9 of it on a battered, water-stained apothecary cabinet, a great dark honeycomb of 100 little drawers, hauled out of the shuttered shop on Cade Street and propped against a fence like a coffin stood on end. The crowd hooted. A woman with no roof buying furniture she could not house. Foolish, they said, and perhaps it was. But there was something sealed inside that ruined cabinet, something patient, something that had waited years in the dark that would not only lift her from ruin, but stitch a broken town back to its feet. She did not know it yet. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Cora Ellison. And if you are watching tonight from a place the world has quietly written off, a town the map forgot, a life the ledgers marked as lost, tell us in the comments where you are, so we may hold your name a moment in the telling. To understand why a hungry woman would give her last coins for a cabinet of empty drawers, you must understand the hand she came from and the town she came into, both of which taught her that value is a thing most people cannot see. Cora was born Cora Byrne in a Missouri River town, the daughter of a cabinet maker who smelled always of linseed and shaved cedar, a quiet man named Fenwick Byrne who believed that wood remembered. He would run his thumb along a warped, discarded board that others meant for the stove and say, "Lo," as if the plank might overhear that a thing was never truly ruined, only misunderstood, and that patience was the one tool no shop could sell you. From him she learned to read grain the way a river pilot reads water, to find the sound heart under the gray, weather-beaten skin, to steam a bent joint straight, and coax a seized drawer loose without splintering its face. She learned that a scarred surface was only a story that had not yet been listened to, and that the mending of a broken thing was a kind of quiet argument with despair. Her mother, Alva, taught her the rest, how to keep a household on almost nothing, how to render tallow and set by herbs against the winter, how to nurse a fever with what grew in the ditch in the dooryard when the doctor was 3 days' ride and the money was none. Alva kept a little cloth-bound book of remedies in a hand so small it looked stitched rather than written, and she made Cora copy each entry twice, once to learn it and once to remember that knowledge, unlike land, could not be foreclosed upon. Cora came west at 20, as a bride, married to Thomas Ellison, a steady, laughing man with silver dust worked permanently into the creases of his knuckles, and together they made their life in Cinnabar Springs, when the town was young and the mountains still seemed generous. She was known, in those good years, for 2 things. The first was her hands. Half the parlors in town held a chair or a chest or a cradle that Cora had rescued from a barn or a fire sale and brought back to breathing life, refusing pay beyond the cost of the varnish because she said the work was already its own wage. The second thing she was known for was her steadiness in sickness. When the winter throat fever came through, or a child took the summer flux, folks sent for Cora Ellison and her mother's little book before they sent for anyone else. And she would sit the night through with a cool cloth and a bitter tea and a voice that did not tremble. She had, as a girl newly arrived, spent 2 seasons at the elbow of the town's own apothecary, a wry and brilliant woman named Naomi Cade, learning the difference between the willow bark that eased and the foxglove that killed before life and marriage carried her other ways. It is worth remembering that apprenticeship. It is the hinge on which everything turns. For now, know only that Cora Ellison was a woman who had been taught, twice over, by a father and by a healer, that the world is forever throwing away exactly the things it will one day be desperate to have back. The fall, when it came the way all the worst falls do, not as one blow but as a slow subtraction, each loss making the next one easier for the world to justify. It began underground. Thomas died in the spring of 1892 when a played-out drift in the Consolidated let go without warning and took 4 men into the dark. And Cora buried a husband with dust still under his nails and no body they would let her wash. Only a closed pine box and a company clerk who pressed $40 into her hand as though that squared the account. She did not fall apart, because women of her making are not permitted to. She took in mending and sold her preserves and kept the little cottage on Poplar Street, spotless, and she told herself that grief was a room you could live beside if you kept the door shut. Then, in the summer of 1893, the nation's price of silver broke like an axle on a mountain road, and Cinnabar Springs, which had been built entirely on the promise of that one bright metal, began to die around her in a single season. The Consolidated closed its gates. The stamp mill went silent so suddenly that people woke in the night to the strangeness of it. Men who had made $4 a day drifted off to Denver or nowhere, and the ones who stayed sat on the porch of the Mercantile with the particular stillness of the newly poor. Cora held on longer than most because she was frugal past the point of pride. But the mortgage Thomas had signed in the fat years came due in the lean ones, and Ezra Crandall's bank held the paper. She went to him in her clean black dress with a plan and a partial payment, and he listened with his fingertips pressed together and his gold watch chain catching the light, and he told her the times were hard for everyone, which is the sort of thing a comfortable man says to a desperate woman to make his cruelty sound like weather. He foreclosed in September. She remembers the sound of the notice being nailed to her own front door more than she remembers his words. She remembers, too, that Crandall's clerk, a nervous young man named Pettibone, would not meet her eyes, and that Crandall himself remarked, folding the deed away, that it was a pity, but the town was finished, and a wise person cut their losses before the whole worthless place blew away. He did not know she heard the greed under the pity, the way a man salivates over a carcass while pretending to mourn it. He was already buying up the emptied shops and lots of Cinnabar Springs for pennies, betting that the railroad or a smelter would someday come, and meaning to own the whole corpse when it did. Cora walked out of the cottage with her carpetbag and her mother's book and the $11.40, and she slept 2 nights in the Methodist church cellar, and on the 3rd day she went to the auction yard because she had nowhere else to be, and because, God help her, she could not stop being her father's daughter. The apothecary cabinet stood at the edge of the yard, where the unwanted things went, the lots too heavy or too homely to fetch a bid. And the moment Cora saw it, something in her chest turned over like a key. She knew it. She knew it the way you know a face across 20 years. It was Naomi Cade's own cabinet, the great mahogany apothecary case that had stood behind the counter of the Cade Street pharmacy for a generation. Its 100 small drawers, each once lettered in gilt with the Latin names of powders and simples. Its brass pulls, worn bright by 10,000 reachings. Naomi Cade had vanished from Cinnabar Springs 11 years before. Under a shadow that no one had ever fully explained, she had gone east, some said, to nurse a dying sister, and simply never returned. Others whispered that she had run from a debt or a broken heart or the law, and the shop had been shuttered and its stock sold, and the mystery had softened into the kind of story a town tells without quite believing. Now her cabinet stood water-stained and gray with dust in the loser's corner of the yard, warped along one flank where a leaking roof had wept on it for a decade, its gilt lettering gone to ghosts, its drawers swollen shut. The auctioneer nearly gave it away with the offer. $9, he said, laughing, for the honeycomb good firewood at least, and mind the splinters. And the crowd laughed with him when the widow Ellison raised her hand. She did not care. She paid her $9, and she borrowed a handcart from the livery on the promise of a mended chair. And she wheeled her ruined treasure to the abandoned lean-to behind the dead pharmacy itself, which no one owned in any way that mattered anymore. And she began, that very evening, to do the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She cleaned it. By the last of the daylight, and then by a stub of candle, Cora Ellison ran a soft cloth over the mahogany, and felt beneath the grime the deep old figure of the wood come up like a face out of deep water, and she loosened the swollen drawers one by one with the patience her father had drilled into her hands, easing each free rather than forcing it, murmuring to the wood, as Fenwick Byrne had murmured, telling it that it was not ruined, only misunderstood. Most of the drawers came out empty, holding nothing but the faded stain of powders long spent and the dry husk of a peppercorn, a snakeroot fragment, the mummified curl of an orange peel. But in the fourth drawer she opened, she found, pressed flat against the back, a single dried sprig of some silvery herb she did not recognize, bound with a thread of red silk, and tucked beneath it a scrap of paper in a small stitched hand she knew at once, because she had copied its like 100 times in her mother's kitchen. It read, in Naomi Cade's writing, "For the mountain fever, when all else fails, the rest is where the light does not reach." Cora sat back on her heels in the dark lean-to with the scrap in her hand and her heart going like a hammer, because two things had just become clear to her at once: that Naomi Cade had left something behind on purpose, and that she had left it for someone with the patience to look. Now, mountain fever was not an idle phrase to anyone in Cinnabar Springs, and least of all that autumn, for the disease had already begun its return. It came most years with the first hard cold, a wasting brain fever that took the very young and the very old, and in the fat years the town had weathered it with the doctor's help and Naomi Cade's tonics, but the doctor had left with the money, and Naomi Cade was 11 years gone, and the few families, too poor or too stubborn to abandon the dying town, were watching their children burn with nothing to give them but cool cloths and prayer. 2 little ones had already been buried on the hill that month, so when Cora read those words for the mountain fever, when all else fails, she did not think of profit. She thought of the Hollis children coughing in the tent by the creek, and of the vain baby that had not been buried but soon might be, and she bent to the cabinet with a new and burning purpose, running her fingers along every seam and joint the way her father had taught her to find the hidden dovetail, the false back, the secret nobody meant to be found by force. It took her the better part of 2 nights. Naomi Cade had been clever, and Fenwick Byrne had been thorough, and Cora, who was the daughter of one and the pupil of the other, was the one soul in the territory equipped to undo what a clever woman had hidden. She found it on the 3rd night. Behind the bottom bank of drawers, where the cabinet met the floor, and where the light truly did not reach, there was a panel that did not ring hollow like waste space, but solid like intent, and when she pressed the 2 lower corners at once the way a jewel box lid gives, a long, shallow drawer slid out with a sigh of old wood, a drawer no auctioneer or looter had ever suspected in 11 years of the cabinet standing in plain sight. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, lay 3 things, and Cora took each one out with hands that shook not from cold now, but from the enormity of what she was touching. The first was a book, a thick formulary, bound in cracked green leather, every page dense with Naomi Cade's stitched small hand, a lifetime of remedies and dosages and careful failures, and near the back, marked with the same red silk thread, the full receipt for the mountain fever tonic that the sprig in the drawer had promised, the herbs, the proportions, the slow method of drawing the medicine out, a formula Naomi had perfected, and, it was plain from her notes, never had the chance to give away before she fled. The second thing was a bundle of letters and, folded among them, a deed, the deed to the pharmacy building and the 2 lots behind it, and beneath that, most staggering of all, a stack of railroad and government-bearer bonds, the kind that belong to whoever holds them, sound bonds drawn on solid Eastern rails and the national debt, untouched by any silver crash, worth Cora could scarcely make her eyes total the figures better than $11,000. And the third thing was a letter addressed in that small hand to no name at all, but simply, to whoever loved this old cabinet enough to save it. She read it there on the floor of the lean-to by her guttering candle, and we will tell you what it said, because it is the heart of everything. Naomi Cade had written that she was leaving Cinnabar Springs because a man she would not name had ruined her, had used a private matter to threaten her livelihood and her good name, a man who traded in other people's desperation and called it business, and that rather than let him seize her shop and her savings through the courts as he meant to, she had turned everything she owned that could not be nailed down into bonds. and hidden them where his kind would never think to look. Inside a homely old cabinet he would appraise at nothing. She wrote that she could not bear to simply take it with her, for it was not truly hers. It had been earned drop by drop from the sick and the poor of that town, and it belonged, she felt, to the town's own healing. So she had left it sealed, trusting that someday, when the mine was gone and the greedy had picked the corpse clean and passed the cabinet by as worthless, some patient soul who could see the value others could not would find her drawer and understand her wish. Use it, she wrote, to make this a place where no child dies for want of $1 or a dose. And she signed it, Naomi Cade, who was also thrown away and found again. Cora Ellison wept then, alone in the dark behind the dead pharmacy. But she did not weep long, because the vein baby was burning up not 400 yards away, and she now held in her hands the two things that could save it, the receipt and the means to gather the herbs. She spent what was left of her own money and traded 2 days of mending for the ingredients she could not gather herself. And she brewed Naomi Cade's tonic exactly as the formulary directed, and she carried it in a stone jar down to the tent by the creek. The vein baby lived. So did the elder Hollis girl who had been given up. Word of it moved through what was left of Cinnabar Springs the way water moves through cracked ground, quiet and then everywhere at once. And within a week, the widow Ellison, who had been laughed at in the auction yard, was the woman the dying town's last families came to at all hours, and she turned none of them away, and she took no more for the medicine than the cost of making it, exactly as she had always done with her father's chairs. She did not tell a living soul about the bonds. Not yet. She had a wish to honor, and honoring it probably would take more than money. It would take the whole town's trust, and it would have to survive the one man certain to try to take it all away. For Ezra Crandall was not a stupid man, and greed keeps its own kind of watch. When he heard that the widow he had put out was suddenly curing the fever from the shell of Naomi Cade's old shop, using Naomi Cade's own recipes, and that she had bought Naomi Cade's own cabinet for $9 in his auction yard, he began to add the sums the way only a banker can. He remembered, and here the old story turned in the light and showed its true face, that he himself was the man Naomi Cade had never named, the man who had ruined her 11 years before, who had learned a private grief in her past and threatened to publish it unless she signed her shop and her savings over to him, and who had been enraged to find, when she fled in the night, that she had somehow taken every dollar with her, leaving him nothing but an empty building and a mystery he had gnawed at for a decade. He had always believed there was money, hidden money, that Naomi Cade had spirited away, and he had bought up half the ruined town partly in the patient hope of one day finding it. And now here was a penniless widow in that very shop, spending nothing yet somehow lacking for nothing, guarding an old cabinet as though it were made of gold. Ezra Crandall came to see Cora Ellison on a gray morning with 2 hired men and a paper, and he was smiling. The paper, he explained in his soft voice, was quite in order. The pharmacy building and the 2 lots behind it had been abandoned property, and he had, only that week, purchased the tax lien upon them from the county for a trifling sum, which made him regrettably, of course, for he did admire her little Charity, the lawful owner of the ground she stood on and everything affixed to it, cabinet included. He would need her to vacate by week's end. He said all this while his hired men eyed the great dark case behind her, and Cora understood with perfect clarity that he did not want the building at all. He wanted what he had convinced himself was inside it, and if he took the cabinet lawfully as a fixture of a building he owned, he could break it apart in private and no one would ever know what had spilled out. She also understood that she could not simply flee with the bonds as Naomi had, because Naomi's whole wish had been that the money never leave, that it heal the very town Crandall meant to pick clean. So Cora Ellison did the bravest thing a cornered person can do. She asked for time 1 week, and she smiled back at him, and she did not run. What she did instead was the thing her whole life had prepared her for. She gathered the misunderstood and the thrown away, and showed the town its own worth. She went that same afternoon to the family she had nursed and to the handful of townspeople too poor or too stubborn to have left the Hollises and the Vanes, Old Pettibone, the clerk who had been unable to meet her eyes at the foreclosure and had since quietly quit the bank in shame, the Methodist minister who had let her sleep in his cellar, the liveryman, the two miners' widows who had lost their homes as she had. She laid Naomi Cade's letter on the table before them, and the deed and the bonds, and she told them everything. That the money had been earned from this town's own sickness and was meant to return to it. That Naomi Cade had hidden it from Ezra Crandall's greed and left it to whoever could see value where he saw firewood. And that Crandall now meant to seize the cabinet under a tax lien before its secret could be spent as its owner had wished. And then Cora told them her plan, which was not to fight Crandall with lawyers he could outspend, but to make the money impossible to steal by making it, that very week, belong publicly to them all. She used the bonds, Naomi Cade's whole fortune, which by any law of the world Cora could have quietly kept or fled with, to do the thing the letter had asked. In the space of that one desperate week, with old Pettibone drawing up the honest papers he had once been too cowed to refuse, Cora Ellison redeemed the tax liens on the pharmacy and on a dozen other seized homes and shops of Cinnabar Springs, buying them back out from under Ezra Crandall's patient bed and deeding them to the families who had lost them, including, we will tell you, the cottage on Poplar Street, which she signed not to herself but held in trust for the town's use. She endowed the old pharmacy as a free dispensary and clinic, stocked from Naomi Cade's formulary, open to any soul in the county who could not pay, and she set aside a fund, administered by the minister and the two widows and honest Pettibone, so that, in Naomi's exact words carved now above the door, no child would die for want of $1 or a dose. By the time Ezra Crandall arrived on the 7th morning with his hired men and his smile, the cabinet he had come to break open was empty of everything but medicine. Its secret already spent past any recovery, poured back into the town in the form of restored deeds and a working clinic, and 100 small drawers full, once more, of simples for the sick. There was nothing left for him to seize, and everything he had schemed to own was now the lawful, recorded, witnessed property of the very people he had meant to inherit. He might still have raged, might have tangled it all in court for years, but for the last quiet turn of the wheel, and this is the justice of the tale, so mark it well. Among the letters in the hidden drawer, Naomi Cade had kept the proof of her own ruin, Ezra Crandall's own hand, his signed demands from 11 years before, the blackmail he had put in writing, in the arrogance of a man who believed his victim would never dare show a soul. Cora had read them by candlelight and understood at last what kind of man had foreclosed on her, and she had made copies, and she had, with Pettibone as her witness, placed the originals in the safe of a Denver attorney, with instructions plain enough that even the town understood their weight. She did not publish them. She did not need to. She simply let Ezra Crandall know, across her own table, in her own soft voice borrowed from his, that the times were hard for everyone, and that a wise man cut his losses before the whole worthless business blew away. He left Cinnabar Springs within the month. His holdings, so many of them bought on credit against a recovery that never came, unwound in his absence, and the man who had told a widow that sentiment was not legal tender learned, at the last, that neither was cruelty, and that a town he had appraised at nothing had been worth all along more than he could keep. He was not jailed. He was not beaten. He was simply, quietly, undone by the very worth he had failed to see, which is the only justice this kind of story believes in, and the truest kind there is. And so we come back to where we began, to the auction yard and the laughter and the widow in gray with $11.40. They laughed when Cora Ellison bought that dusty apothecary cabinet, because they saw a foolish woman in a piece of ruined furniture, and they were wrong about both, in the same way and for the same reason. For value, the real kind, the kind that outlasts a silver crash and a banker's greed, does not announce itself. It waits, water-stained and passed over, in the loser's corner of the yard, for someone patient enough to clean away the grime, and clever enough to find the drawer where the light does not reach. Cora Ellison had been thrown away too, put out by a man who called her a loss on a ledger, and like Naomi Cade before her, and like the cabinet itself, she was not ruined, only misunderstood, and she was found again in the finding of others. She lived out her years in Cinnabar Springs, which did not die after all. In the cottage on Poplar Street, she had given back to the town, and the town had given back to her, mending chairs for the price of the varnish, and fevers for the price of the herbs. And every soul who passed the free clinic on Cade Street read the words above its door and knew the name of the woman who had made them true. "Settle in," we said at the start, "and let us tell you the story of Cora Ellison. Now you know it, and now she is yours to remember too." Thank you for sitting with us in the lamplight a little while, for staying through the cold parts to reach the warm ones, and for believing, as we do, that the thrown-away things and the thrown-away people are so often only waiting for the right patient hands. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they were never worthless, only overlooked. And before you go, let us leave you with one question to carry into your week. The question that lives at the heart of everything Cora Ellison did. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had written off? Tell us in the comments. We read them all, and we hold them close. Until next time, keep your eyes on the corners no one looks in, keep your hands patient and your heart open, and stay close.